Okay, we want to thank our three speakers, and what I'm going to do is take maybe a minute or two and take some of the notes that I got from the morning sessions, and I've cross-referenced them with some of the things that the speakers just presented. And then I would like to open up the room for you to ask questions about how we think we can solve some of these challenges, because what we may have the speakers to do also is just to give us one challenge, and then we will go into a discussion. This morning, there were, in the sessions that I attended, there were attention given to inclusion, into building confidence in students, a sense of belonging, having the right type of support structure, organizational design, identity development in mathematics and science, not just identity, but in those specific subjects, motivation and interest, self-efficacy. How do we encourage students to go beyond, you can do it, but I believe that you can do it, which is a change in the culture of the teachers and the schools and the leadership that are working with youth, or even at the university level. Another cross-reference would be having to do with stereotypes. There is just a wealth of materials on stereotypes and how those clues, situational clues that are very, very small and minor, can start a recursive cycle of negative feeling of lack of self-worth and a sense of self and a sense of belonging. And when students or even adults, including the women at the University of Washington that were in the computer science classes, once they get that feeling, they normally, it takes something to break that recursive cycle and get them back on the positive side. A lot of this work is ongoing also with the American Association of University Women, and it has some implication for what happens in schools. There's also attention to intersectionality studies where you look at issues related to gender in the STEM fields. There's also a need to look for whether people have the wherewithal to engage in what we call upward social mobility, like at the university level, or in schools where students might feel like I will not challenge myself to take these advanced courses because I don't feel like I can perform at the level I'm expected to perform, and they don't have the environment in which to do that. So academic advancement, work from the communities. We talked about climate and environment. Explicit showed up in several instances in different ways, whether it's from a bias or from whether or not you are explicit in what your expectation of students are expected to do. Self-regulation, about learning, again, self-monitoring. One of the studies that I recently one of my PIs was doing was looking at how do kids, what is their executive function level, and how do their understanding of the general knowledge of the world, general comprehension of the world, actually play into their ability to do interventions, and as well as learn to internalize things so that they can see that they really do have the ability to do that. So those are some of the things that were crossed over. And the list actually goes on. And I think they're all important because what we have to do is shift our thinking from just content and skills based for the 21st century to include some of these factors in the affective domain that actually interferes with a kid's ability. Because the research also shows that many of the students, as well as women, who drop out of their profession in mid-career, or students out of the pipeline, has nothing to do with their ability to do it. They have the ability. It's these other factors that interfere and cause them not to be successful or proceed to graduation. So having heard all those things, and that was a lot that we've said, what I would like for us to do is look at a couple of the challenges that you will pull out of this. We can ask the presenters to give us a challenge, and then we would like for you to respond. And also, in your response, you might want to add other things you might feel are important as well for high schools of the future. Okay, you want to start off?
Sure. So I would say one challenge with our work is that from the perspective of high schools are often described as balkanized by subject matter. Their large comprehensive high schools are sorted by ability level, so they're general tracks, honors tracks, AP courses. And so for some reason, it ends up, the teachers end up identifying within their subject matter, particularly, and each of these subject matter has its own culture. And so it's difficult for them to then think about this social emotional side of the student. They see it as not their core purpose. So we find that when we interview the adults that are participating in this project, that they say, well, this is what I went into teaching to do, to connect with kids. This is what I'm supposed to do anyway. It's good to be reminded to do this. So I think for us, the challenge is helping them understand that actually there are specific routines that they can do. And we have lots of schools in our study. We strongly believe that every school needs to figure it out for themselves, as long as there are these core ideas and they're trying to figure out how to make these core ideas work for them, that's the way they need to go. But this is a challenge to do that.
Okay, do we have anyone who would like to respond to that particular challenge or bring one up of your own? Sorry, I don't have any mics either, so you have to speak loud. Yeah, okay, thank you. So would you like to start?
I do have a question. I'm a computer science teacher, and the National Center for Women in Information Technology, the CSDA, has done a lot of outreach, and I have posters of Grace Hopper and other women in technology in my classroom. It's been a real challenge to get young ladies to say, oh, computer science, why would I have a place in there? I know we just showed at the last conference the women of ENIAC. But on the other hand, I took a group of girls to a Code Girls event at Microsoft, something exclusively for my female students, causing some jealousy for the boys. How come they get to go? I say, you have a Y chromosome. And we also have an after-school program called Girls That Code. And I had one of my students did a summer program. I teach this outside of Boston. It was also exclusively for females. So I get, yes, we need to encourage young women to be in a place perhaps where they feel safe, to question, to probe. But I'm also wondering if it's a metaphor, a bridge too far to say that these are only exclusively for women and the guys are left out. I don't want to put a barrier up that's the other way either. I want to be able to encourage both genders to participate.
Yeah, yeah, that's it's a tricky issue and a common issue, right? And I think that there's value in relying on research evidence to sort of create the foundation for why these things are important. So there's certainly research evidence showing the value of making sure women who are working in a field stereotypic for women, like girls in computer science, aren't the only one or in the minority, right? And so I've done some of this work myself, showing that when women are in solo status like that, they actually do worse than if you put those same women in groups where there are other women there. I mean, they don't stand out in terms of a negatively stereotyped identity. And so if people knew about that kind of work and were convinced by that, perhaps they could see the value of moving girls out of that solo situation and into a context where stereotype threat would be reduced, right? Because you don't stand out in terms of that gender. So there's that point, and then also the just the general knowledge and awareness of the different experience that girls have or may have in computer science that really highlights the need for that kind of an action, right? To give them more the experience that the boys are having all the time, every day. And so I guess I'm just generally saying that more awareness of empirical evidence is what I found to be most helpful in changing people's minds and getting them to support these kinds of initiatives.
Well, I shared the GitHub study, just came out recently, where they gender-neutral programming, women had a higher success rate of having their code being accepted than men did.
Yeah.
But when gender was included, women had a lesser rate. So
Wow.
I tell my girls, look, you're better programmers than the boys are, it's proven.
Yeah.
Well, and I can actually say that there are some interventions in some of the studies that we are supporting through NSF funding that are very simple interventions, some of the writing exercises and things of that nature that are working to get more girls involved, but it's not hurting the males. Also, may work better with African-American students, but it doesn't hurt non-African-American students. All of these studies, of course, I have to say, are context sensitive, but it goes back to doing small things that can make a big difference. I think I see a hand in the back.
So you mentioned the structure of high schools as being challenging, especially with the core subjects. And so we found our work in middle school, it's embedded in the regular school day, and it's also embedded in either core subjects or forced electives, if you can get your head around that one. So there's these exploratory wheels. But when students when everyone's expected to take these courses, then we see the outcomes are very strong for both genders. It's when sometimes the elective courses are offered and perceptions of the course play into students enrolling in that course or parents or what have you. Societal influences are motivating students to take those courses. That's where you see these kind of 80-20 gender ratios, and then these other outcomes occur. So here's a question. In mathematics, there's a somewhat equivalent participation rate in high school between boys and girls. You look back in the 70s, it was different. Going forward with these types of integrated STEM courses, to what extent do you want to push forward and have these be requirements versus electives? That will have implications for how the high school is organized, because if there's an expectation that, well, anyone can take this, the opportunity to engage in those subjects is going to be limited to what's coming into that course.
Well, go ahead.
So I'm also on Sharon Lynch's project, and that you heard about earlier, about the inclusive STEM high schools. And one of the things that we found in these exemplar schools is that they had only a little bit of wiggle room with electives. So everyone was expected to take the same curriculum. And we were surprised at first when, we came and we're like, what do you mean? You're forcing everyone to take the same stuff? Like, what about individuality? And what they said was that kids naturally will opt out, and they just don't have the confidence in themselves to succeed. And so we were finding that, this is a really good idea. And High Tech High played around with it a little bit just to see if they were doing the right thing. And what they did find was that the girls and first generation college goers were opting out of the harder classes. So my answer is, I would like to see some requirement at some point, but there needs to be supports for students. You can't just expect them, to understand. And whether those supports are building a culture where it's okay to fail and take it again and again until you master it, or you have more micro supports like self-regulated learning where you can, employ these small things to help build capacity.
We found in our original study that the high-performing schools encourage students to take a rigorous coursework. And there is substantial research that suggests that's a good idea, but only if you have the supports there. And so I think it can be a negative experience for students if those supports aren't there, but if the supports are there, then it can be very positive.
And supports is very broad, because that may include that if you're going to require all students to take high-level courses, there's a lot you have to do both with the organization of the school as well as with the teachers. And if the teachers are not prepared to teach all students and have the expectation that they all can learn at that level, that becomes an issue too. Now yes.
I was just going to add to that comment, is I work with Career Academies in California, which is like a small STEM school inside of a larger comprehensive high school, and we found exactly the same thing, and would echo the importance of student supports. And in fact, there are people at Stanford and so forth talking about integrated student support systems that are very intentional, that include academic support, social emotional support, getting the counselors involved in addition to the teachers, really making sure that there's a counselor assigned to the academy, for example, so that the kids are not falling through the cracks, and with a very rigorous, and this is somewhat controversial, but we have in California the UC admission requirements, which ratchet up the requirements for graduation, or at least for admission. And that's, again, very difficult to enforce in some areas, but it does, in fact, narrow the options, and I'm pleased to hear that that's actually a positive thing, because that's a finding that I would take back.
Okay. Yeah, we have anyone else like to, okay, we have two over here, please.
Hi, Erin. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the study you did with the self-efficacy, and wondering if you looked at that on a gender basis as well.
Yeah, not only did we look at self-efficacy, but we went back in the data and looked at, we had asked the students in the assignments when they were finished to report on did they feel more like an expert and why or why not, and how did they know they were right when they did this guided inquiry, right? Because there's no kind of final answer for it. And I can share the piece with you. It's like an online piece, but we looked at the gender differences, and there were 167 kids who had actually, completed all the data we were looking for, and split pretty much half and half. And of the boys, they all, when asked how they knew they were right, they almost all said, "I am smart," or "I just knew it." Whereas the girls said, "I checked with my group," or "our group checked with other people." So it was more of a community thing. There was only one girl who was in the "I am smart" category, and the rest were. It was uncanny when we finally went back and looked at things. The other thing we found was that with girls, and you hear this similar thing again, with girls, their self-efficacy on questions that had symbolic representations were low, but they were significantly higher in performance on those items than the boys. And so vice versa, where the whole group, and this was not just gender, but the whole group, when they had to write out an answer, they were usually wrong, but they had very high self-efficacy on it. So there was also something about communicating science in terms of symbolic technical language, which resonates a lot, and sort of, everyday explain yourself language, so a lot to work on.
And Denise, would you like to add to that a little bit?
Just your story there just reminded me about some other work that I'd done where we had students learn some material and then answer questions about it in kind of an oral exam format in a group. And this was on the solo status. So sometimes they did it as the only member of their gender there, and sometimes they did it with other members of their gender there. But one finding we found was that women were more likely to just say they didn't know an answer, like, yes, I don't know, whereas men were more likely to say something that sounded good but was not the right answer, but they said it with confidence, and that made them look, competent, even though they weren't necessarily giving the right answer. And so it was just a different sort of gendered style of answering the question.
Okay, and I think there was another, this gentleman here, you don't have, not anymore. Okay, well, we have over here.
It actually goes back to the earlier point around the gender and how we can both promote women in some of these areas as well as, so has any of the research really looked at the kind of the opposite, which is changing, how can we intervene to change boys' behavior so that they're more inclusive? And I think of all of those computer camp stories where you have a bunch of boys and one or two girls raising their hand, and they end up like that chart of the technical, non-technical. The boys talk over the women, they take all the cool roles, and they give the little girls you get to take notes. And so part of it's changing that behavior on the boys' side, because the girls can do all they want, but if there isn't a comparable change, and it sounds like you alluded to some of that in your work, but I was wondering broadly what kind of research and interventions either exist now or could in the future that can really help make that change as well.
That's such a great observation. And I totally agree with the idea that the majority group, which in science tends to be the boys or the men, right, they set the tone, right? They set the norm and set the climate. And so they're the ones really who we should be working on, right? Instead of teaching girls how to deal with a climate that is chilly for them, right? So we've done some work that we were pleased to see did something that changed the boys, although these were undergraduates. But in one study, we gave incoming freshmen in engineering in some of their courses, a presentation was given that talked about an egalitarian social norm. So it basically said, welcome to Michigan, we're glad you're here. Here, people don't tell racist and sexist jokes. I mean, it wasn't this blatant, right? But they basically sent the message that that's not done here. And if people do that, they really, face some social rejection, I told the story about how someone couldn't find a study partner because they engaged in that kind of behavior. And then we did a survey, and of course some other students didn't see the presentation, and then we took some survey items at the end of the semester and found that it was really something that changed the boys. They changed the male students, that they said that they would be more likely to speak out against racism that they heard in their classrooms in engineering, like I'd be more likely to do something about it. And they also expressed more positive attitudes towards diversity in engineering at the end. And there was no movement among the women, who tended to already be kind of high on both of those things anyway. So, but I thought it was a good thing that we were targeting the people who set the tone. And if they're the ones whose behavior sets the social norm, if we can change them to be more egalitarian, that should have a benefit for everybody, right? So that was one example of something that does that ideal action or strategy.
Okay, do we have another question? I would encourage you to look on our website. I think most of you all know NSF website. It's a very www.nsf.gov, and if you go on the first page, homepage, there is an icon that says awards. And if you were to click on that icon, you can go in and do a search you can have keywords, or if you know a PI's name, you will be surprised how many different studies will come up along the lines of exactly what is being discussed here. There's an awful lot of research on affective factors in the hard sciences like engineering, physics, and so forth. As a matter of fact, I did one of my small independent studies internal to NSF and found that in the physics directorate, there were more studies about beliefs. Who believes that a person can do this, and what are your beliefs about teaching and so forth. And you wouldn't necessarily expect that to be true. You would expect that to be true in the education directorate, and that's where we had the fewest studies. So I encourage you to go online, again, not only looking for funding opportunities, because they are there too, there are plenty of them. I encourage you to look at the Dear Colleague letters. There are many of them there that specialize in different areas. Increasingly, we are getting those areas in the affective domain to be prevalent in what we are calling for in all of our solicitations. But at the same time, you will find abstracts and contact information for people who are doing cutting-edge research, who are doing great interventions, and whose information, just as what you've heard today from our panelists, can help you make decisions about where you want to go with high schools, if you work in any way in high schools in the future. I think that with all the things we see going on in the world, when the students come into the setting, it's very difficult for them to settle in. And so we're going to have to start dealing with some of these other things that we have not dealt with in the past. So that concludes our time. We made up 3 minutes. And so you're only 2 minutes late for your break. We will.
One amendment to the schedule, we're actually going to be skipping the break and just moving it ahead to the 2:15 session. So if folks wouldn't mind sticking around, it's right here in this room. Stay right where you are.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much. And thank you. Thank the panelists for their contributions.